This evening we have Randall Balmer, who is the John Phillips Professor in Religion at Dartmouth College and is an Episcopal priest. He's the author of more than a dozen books, including Redeemer, The Life of Jimmy Carter, God in the White House, A History, How Faith Has Shaped the Presidency from John F. Kennedy to George W. Bush, Mine Eyes Have Seen the Glory, A Journey into the Evangelical Subculture in America, which is now in its 5th edition and has been made into an award-winning 3-part series for PBS. And most recently, Bad Faith, The Rise of the Religious Right. Tonight, he will be speaking about America's Best Idea, The Separation of Church and State, his newest book. And I'm sure Randall will be more than happy to sign any books after the event. So please give a big round of applause for Randall Balmer.
Thank you. Hello, friends and neighbors. Good to see you. Thank you for coming. Good to see some familiar faces and some I haven't yet met. So let's fix that afterwards. So I also want to acknowledge my editor. Chip Fleischer is in the back. I'm rarely at a loss for what is the next book I'm going to write. In fact, I was on the phone this afternoon with Garrison Keillor about writing a biography of Garrison Keillor, so we'll see. But Chip approached me a few years ago and asked if I was interested in writing a small book on the relationship between church and state. One thing led to another, and you have this very small book. It's intentionally small, pocket-sized, good guide to what I call America's Best Idea, with apologies to Ken Burns, who claims that national parks are America's best idea. I respectfully disagree. I think America's best idea is the First Amendment and the separation of church and state, and I'll try to make that case tonight. When the founders were trying to think about how to configure the new nation, they had several things in mind when it came to religion. First of all, you had the experience back in the old world, the wars of religion in France, the English Revolution in England, and all of the contestation over religion. And the founders wanted to avoid that. They wanted to find a way to sidestep all of those ancient prejudices and animosities that had given rise to so much unrest back in the old world. The other thing they had to consider was the religious composition of the colonies by the end of the 18th century. And when I teach my course on religion in North America, early in the course I put a map of the Atlantic seaboard on the slide. And I asked students to help me to identify the various religious groups who settled in each of these areas. And it's a remarkable diversity. Of course, in New England, you've got Puritans, but you also have the Pilgrims, who preceded the Puritans by 10 years. Pilgrims are different from Puritans. Most people don't recognize that. The Pilgrims had already separated from the Church of England, whereas the Pilgrims thought of themselves, at least in the early years, as being part of the Church of England and wanting to reform it by constructing their city on a hill in the howling wilderness of Massachusetts. You go to south from there, you have Connecticut, which is also Puritan, but a different band of Puritans, called the New Haven Colony. Rhode Island, you have a remarkable laboratory of religious diversity due to Roger Williams. And I'll circle back to Roger Williams here in a little while. But Roger Williams insisted on liberty of conscience in this new colony in Rhode Island. You head south from there to New York, or earlier than that, New Netherland, and you have various religious groups. You have the Dutch Reformed Church, which organized in 1628 under a pastor by the name of Jonas Michaelius, who even in the first celebration of worship there noted the extraordinary religious diversity in, at that time, New Amsterdam, and now, of course, New York City. So you had French Protestants or Huguenots, you had Quakers on Long Island, you had the Lutherans up in the Hudson Valley, as well as the Dutch Reformed, even some Catholics up in the Mohawk Valley, an extraordinary diversity, and then after 1654, Jews as refugees from Recife in Latin America and South America, coming to New York City and settling and building the Mill Street Synagogue. Go south from there, you have New Jersey, again, religious diversity, the Dutch Reformed people up in the northern part of New Jersey, the area around New Brunswick, the Raritan Valley. But then you also had Presbyterians, Scots-Irish Presbyterians coming to Port Elizabeth and Perth Amboy, and then finally inland to Princeton, where of course they formed the College of New Jersey, now known as Princeton University. And you had Quakers. West from there, Pennsylvania. This is William Penn's Holy Experiment. Penn himself was a Quaker, but he wanted to open it up to other religious groups as well so they could coexist and flourish. And you have all sorts of very, very interesting people in colonial Pennsylvania, Mennonites, Amish. My favorite group is the Schwenkfelders. They were extraordinary in their diversity in Pennsylvania. Heading south from there, you've got Maryland, founded by English Catholics, although they very quickly lost their toehold in terms of religious freedom in Maryland, eventually became Anglican before the American Revolution. And Delaware, anyone know who settled in Delaware? What is now Delaware? Swedish Lutherans. Who knew, right? South from there, Virginia, again, you have Anglicans. By the middle of the 18th century, you have Baptist groups. And then the southern colonies, I'll kind of lump them all together. Ostensibly Anglican, but also other religious groups. A lot of folk religious practices in the south, but also groups like the Moravians, settling in South Carolina before a group of them went up north to Pennsylvania, settling in Bethlehem on Christmas Eve in 1745. So my point is to say that the colonies were extraordinarily diverse when it came to religion. So as the founders faced the task of trying to configure religion and politics, church and state in the new nation, how are they going to do that? Are they going to support any one particular group as being the established or state religion? If they chose Anglicans, for example, Puritans wouldn't be happy. If they chose Baptists, the Dutch Reform wouldn't be happy. If they chose Unitarians, as Jefferson probably would have liked, everyone would have been unhappy. It just would not have worked. And so they had to figure out how to do this. And they even defeated a proposal from Governor Patrick Henry in Virginia, who proposed simply designating generic Christianity as the established church or the state religion in Virginia. And the bill was heading for passage, and James Madison wisely sought to put the brakes on. He said, let's delay this a bit. He wrote his famous memorial and remonstrance against the idea of even enshrining Christianity generically as the religion of the new nation. So this is what the founders were facing when they talked about church and state. The religious contestation in the old world and the extraordinary religious diversity along the Atlantic seaboard in the American colonies. And so when the First Amendment was being drafted by James Madison as part of the Bill of Rights, he was drawing on an image, a metaphor that he had picked up from Roger Williams, the person I mentioned earlier. Roger Williams was a graduate of Cambridge University, came to the New World, eventually settled in Salem, Massachusetts as a Puritan minister, but very quickly ran afoul of the Puritan authorities because he opposed the close association between church and state that the Puritans were trying to establish in Massachusetts Bay Colony. And he thought it was bad, both for the state as well as for the faith. And so in 1644, he wrote a book called The Bloody Tenet of Persecution, in which he laid out his famous metaphor about the garden of the church and the wilderness of the world being separated by a wall of separation. So that's the metaphor that the founders were drawing on when the First Amendment was drafted and eventually ratified by the states in 1791. There's been a lot of controversy, especially in recent years. Well, let me go back. Let me stick with history here for a moment. Throughout American history, there have been various attempts to bridge this wall of separation between church and state. To say, no, it really wasn't intended that way by the founders, and we need to acknowledge that the United States is and should be and should remain a Christian nation. This is the whole ideology behind Christian nationalism, which is flaring right now, and we can talk about that a little bit later if you like. But one of the things that the Confederacy picked up on from the U.S. Constitution at the beginning of the Civil War was that the U.S. Constitution contains no direct acknowledgement of God or Christianity. And so when the Confederacy was drafting its Constitution, they took pains to include that language in the Confederate Constitution. Well, a lot of people in the North, particularly pastors, ministers, took notice of that, and they formed an organization that it was known by various names, but it came eventually to be known as the National Reform Association, an early form of the NRA, I guess. National Reform Association, that proposed a constitutional amendment that would have inserted all sorts of religious and Christian language into the Constitution, particularly the preamble, acknowledging Jesus as the Lord of the nations and that sort of thing. And they got a fairly good following from that. The head of this movement was a man named William Strong, who was a justice on the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, and who later was appointed to the U.S. Supreme Court by Ulysses S. Grant in 1870. And they were pushing their case to amend the Constitution to make it explicitly, to make the United States explicitly a Christian nation. They took their petition all the way to the White House, to Abraham Lincoln, who wisely temporized and said, the task of amending the Constitution should not be undertaken lightly. I'll think about it and get back to you, in other words. Don't call me, I'll call you. And wisely, nothing happened with this proposed amendment. That hasn't stopped other organizations from doing similar sorts of efforts. In the Cold War, something called the Christian Amendment Association was begun in Topeka, Kansas, eventually moved to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, again proposing an amendment that would acknowledge Christianity explicitly as the religion of the nation, and stating that the United States was explicitly a Christian nation. That too was turned away by the Congress, but in the Eisenhower administration, as I'm sure you know, Congress did succeed in inserting under God into the Pledge of Allegiance in 1954, and then changing the national motto in 1956 from E pluribus unum to In God We Trust, which of course is emblazoned on our money, as Stephen Colbert says, right where it belongs. In the 1960s, another effort in the wake of the various Supreme Court school prayer decisions, the decision that did away with required Bible reading in public schools as well as prescribed prayers in public schools. A lot of people were upset about this, and an amendment came before Congress sponsored by Everett Dirksen of Illinois, the minority leader of the Senate, who said, I'm positively evangelical about this. I want this to pass. Fortunately, Mike Mansfield, the majority leader, prevailed, and they said, no, we're not going to do that. So these have been various attempts in recent years to change the Constitution in order to acknowledge that the United States is and always has been a Christian nation. What's happening now, I think, is this whole movement of Christian nationalism is taking a different tack. That is to say, they're not so much trying to amend the Constitution, they're trying to take an incremental approach, particularly through the states that have Republican supermajorities, as well as working through the court system, and unfortunately the Supreme Court is complicit in all this. I like to say, I wish the Supreme Court had half as much deference to the First Amendment as it does to the Second Amendment. And this is the place we're in right now, with the Supreme Court really, I think, bridging this wall of separation between church and state. One of the bright lines throughout American history has always been public or taxpayer support for public education, for religious education. That is to say, not using taxpayer money for religious education. In the 19th century, there was a so-called Blaine Amendment that was presented to Congress. It passed the House of Representatives. James Blaine was a member of Congress from Maine who became Speaker of the House of Representatives. He was also a senator from Maine and served as Secretary of State in 3 different administrations and was the Republican Party's nominee for president in, I believe, 1884. Don't quote me on that date. But he was the one who proposed the Blaine Amendment that would forbid taxpayer money going to religious education. It did not pass the Senate, even though it had passed the House of Representatives with the necessary majority for an amendment. But 37 states adopted some version of the Blaine Amendment in the 19th century that marked that careful distinction between public support for public education and public support for religious education. So for more than a century, this has been a bright line. When John Kennedy was running for president in 1960, one of his promises on the campaign trail is that he would oppose any attempt to use public money for parochial schools. That line now has been obliterated by the Supreme Court in the Espinoza decision out in Montana and also the Macon decision in Maine, not to mention the Bremerton decision about school prayer on the 50-yard line in Washington State. By the way, Jesus said to pray in your closet. I don't think he mentioned the 50-yard line, but I may have missed that somewhere along the way. So these Christian nationalists are making their case. And one of the people who's really out front in this is a guy by the name of David Barton, who has a BA degree in Christian education from Oral Roberts University in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And he claims to be a historian. And he wrote a book, he's written several books, but he wrote a book called The Jefferson Lies that was published in 2012. And it became a New York Times bestseller, in which he argued that the founders were evangelical Christians. That's one of his claims, which is so preposterous as to not even merit a response, but that the founders intended to form a Christian nation. A friend of mine who recently retired from Grove City College in Pennsylvania, Warren Throckmorton, has done yeoman service in hunting down these quotations. Turns out most of the quotations that David Barton uses in this book were either wrenched out of context or fabricated out of whole cloth. He just made them up. So egregious were these errors that his very conservative publisher, Thomas Nelson Publisher in Nashville, pulled the book from circulation. Now remember, this was a New York Times best-selling book. And we have a publisher here, pulling a best-selling book from publication is not good business practice, let's put it that way. But it was so egregious. Nevertheless, David Barton still has the ear of a lot of politicians in Washington, including Mike Johnson, but also other members of the religious right, claiming that the United States is and always has been a Christian nation. Well, how do we refute that? Well, I think you do so by history. You do it through theology as well. I'll get to that in a minute, but history, I think, is very important. And that is to say that despite David Barton's claims that 53 out of the 55 founders were evangelical Christians, I don't know how to start on that one. I'd like to say that with a very possible exception of John Witherspoon, who was president of the College of New Jersey, a Presbyterian minister, and Benjamin Rush, a physician, none of the founders would be welcome as members of any congregation now advocating for Christian nationalism. It just wouldn't happen. So he claims that the founders were Christians. And that you have to refute historically by going through each one, and clearly that's not the case. Most of the founders were some form of deist, which believes in a kind of impersonal, disinterested deity. That is, there is a creator who created the universe, but the creator has no interest in the day-to-day operations of the universe. Thomas Jefferson, for example, admired Jesus enormously, but he had no patience for any supernatural claims for Jesus or any of the miracles. And so one of his projects later in life was literally to excise from the New Testament any reference to miracles or any reference to the divinity of Jesus. And all of this was published posthumously as what we know today as the Jefferson Bible. So to suggest that Thomas Jefferson was an evangelical Christian is just preposterous. The other bit of evidence is something called the Treaty of Tripoli. At the end of George Washington's administration, he negotiated, or his administration negotiated, a treaty with the Barbary Coast states called the Treaty of Tripoli. It was sent to the Senate for ratification by John Adams, read aloud before the entire Senate, and ratified by the Senate unanimously on July 7th, 1797. Article 11 of the Treaty of Tripoli reads, "As the government of the United States is not in any sense founded on the Christian religion." It goes on, but that's the relevant part. As the government of the United States is not in any sense founded on the Christian religion. Pretty clear. The other thing David Barton likes to say is that the phrase separation of church and state appears nowhere in the Constitution. I'll give him that one. He's absolutely right about that. However, and this is, you would think would be especially important to somebody who calls himself an originalist, right? It's relevant to consider what the founders themselves understood about the First Amendment. How did they interpret the First Amendment? And the best evidence we have is a letter that Thomas Jefferson, as president, wrote to the Danbury Baptists, Danbury, Connecticut, on New Year's Day, 1802. And the Danbury Baptists were very eager to ascertain that Thomas Jefferson understood the importance of disestablishing religion, not having a state church. In that letter, I'm going to quote it imperfectly, but I'll paraphrase. He wrote to the Danbury Baptists, "I contemplate with sovereign reverence that act of the whole American people which," and then he quotes from the First Amendment, "Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof," end quote, thus establishing a wall of separation between church and state. So that's where the phrase comes from. Obviously, it echoes Roger Williams' metaphor from an earlier century. But that was certainly Thomas Jefferson's understanding of the First Amendment, America's best idea. I think the second way to refute the Christian nationalists is theological. Jesus, we've heard of him, said, "My kingdom is not of this world." Let's go home. That's pretty clear. He also said, "Render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar, unto God the things that are God." We can have a debate about what that means theologically, but at least it suggests two different realms, it seems to me. The realm of Caesar, the realm of God. As was mentioned in the introduction, I'm an Episcopal priest. A few weeks ago, I was preaching on the lectionary, the text, and I noticed one single verse between two very well-known passages in the book of John. And the one passage is about the feeding of the 5,000, and the second is Jesus walking on the Sea of Galilee. And between that, there's a single verse that reads, again, I'm paraphrasing, "Jesus perceived that the crowd was about to take him away and make him king, and so he retreated into the wilderness." Jesus had no aspirations for political office or to be crowned a king, it seems to me. The third argument I would mount against the Christian nationalists is practical. That is to say, I think the separation of church and state has worked remarkably well for more than 200 years. In 1776, Adam Smith wrote a very thick tome called The Wealth of Nations, which is a brief for free market capitalism. You've heard, free market capitalism, I don't need to explain that. But one of his examples was religion. He said, if religion is not tied with the state, religion is going to flourish. And as a historian of religion in America, I can tell you that that prediction has been vindicated over and over and over. We have hundreds, thousands of religious entrepreneurs, to extend the economic metaphor, who are always competing with one another in this free marketplace of religion in American life, giving us a vibrant, salubrious religious culture in the United States. And I'm saying nothing about the quality of religious life. That's another conversation, another lecture perhaps. But in terms of vibrancy and the quantity of religious life in America, the First Amendment, I think, with the separation of church and state, has worked remarkably well. I'm going to return now to Roger Williams and his metaphor about separating the garden of the church from the wilderness of the world. I think we in the 21st century don't really understand the import of that metaphor. That is to say, Roger Williams and his contemporaries were not members of the Dartmouth Outing Club or the Sierra Club. They did not share our romantic post-Thoreauvian romance with wilderness. Wilderness for them was a place of darkness where evil lurked. And so when Roger Williams is talking about protecting the garden of the church from the wilderness of the world, his principal concern is guarding the integrity of the faith from too close an association with the state. I'll give you an example of this. Many of you remember in July of 2001, the Chief Justice of the Alabama Supreme Court, Roy Moore, plopped a 2.5-ton granite monument in the lobby of the Judicial Building in Montgomery, Alabama, emblazoned with the Ten Commandments. He also insisted that no other religious representations be in that space, denied a petition, for example, from the Alabama Humanist Association, both members, no doubt. No, won't do that, just the Ten Commandments. I happen to be one of the expert witnesses in that case, and after Judge Thompson ruled correctly that the monument represented a violation of the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment and ordered it removed, one of the protesters screamed, "Get your hands off my God." I think one of those commandments said something about graven images. And that was precisely Roger Williams' point. Linking the church with the state ultimately compromises the integrity of the faith. And we could have a whole other lecture about what's happened in American politics and religion over the last 50 years with the emergence of the religious right and the compromising of the integrity of the faith, but that's a whole other topic. One more bit of evidence, and I'm going to quote from the book here. Sandra Day O'Connor, in her final decision on church-state matters before she retired from the Supreme Court, wrote, "Those who would renegotiate the boundaries between church and state must answer a difficult question. Why would we trade a system that has served us so well for one that has served others so poorly?" I'll leave it there. Thank you. And I'm happy to take questions if that's all right. I don't know who's... Yes, please.
Religion is a matter of faith.
Yeah.
A belief in religion, like so many things, is a matter of faith. You use logic to try and dispel what some people feel is their faith. I believe that this is the way it is.
Right.
How do you sort of deal with that?
Well, I'm a historian, so I believe in the power of history, the importance of history, and so that's really why I wrote this book, to say, look, historically, this is what happened. It's not as it's been presented by various people. So it's one thing to have faith, and I think faith is a precious commodity, especially in an Enlightenment age, frankly. I think faith is very important, but I think when you have people who are intentionally distorting the truth, that needs to be called out. That's not a matter of faith. That's simply, it's heresy, I suppose, to put it in religious language. So I think history is important for dispelling those misconceptions.
I'm thinking about the people who, quote unquote, don't have a faith.
Yeah.
And so where do they figure in this?
Yeah, I think, well, the question was thinking about people who don't have faith, where do they figure in this? And I think, it's a logical corollary of the First Amendment that it protects the freedom of religion, but also protects freedom for people who don't profess a religion. I'm not sure that the founders would have articulated it that way because they didn't think of it in those terms. But I think over the course of the years and the centuries, we've come to recognize that people without faith have just as many rights as people who claim to have faith. And that brings up a very important point, too, I think, about the whole issue of church and state. I consider myself a patriot, not in the flag-waving sense or wearing silly caps, but I'm a patriot because our charter documents argue against a majoritarian society. That is, the founders were very careful to protect the rights of minorities. Now, I have to acknowledge in the same breath that we as Americans haven't always lived up to that ideal. People of color, women, have not always enjoyed equality. I won't dispute that for a moment. But we try to live into our better selves, it seems to me, and to recognize that these principles are important. And we are not a majoritarian society. That is to say, even though a majority of Americans claim to be Christians, again, we can debate the quality of that faith, which is not for me to judge, but that does not mean that Christian values and Christian principles should govern our country. Now, the Christian nationalists think otherwise, of course, because they have the numbers, they have majority. They think they're going to be able to wield their majority to change the world. And by the way, the whole Christian nationalism stuff, if you look at some of the proposals, what they would do were they to prevail, and I have to say they're doing pretty well right now in terms of prevailing. The proposals run anywhere from outlawing same-sex marriage and abortion, even divorce, to utterly rewriting America's civil and criminal codes to comport with the book of Leviticus, or what they consider to be biblical principles. So it's a very real threat, but the Constitution, I think, argues against that because it's not a majoritarian society.
I'm wondering if it's useful and interesting to ask how we might compare regarding this issue with other leading democracies, how they're handling the church and state.
Yeah, that's a good question, how other leading democracies are handling this issue. I'm not sure that many of them have our configuration. It's, England has the established church is the Church of England. But to get back to Adam Smith's point, last time I looked at the figures, and that was probably a couple decades ago, fewer than 3% of the population showed up in the Church of England on any given Sunday. That's probably, 1/3 of that now. But you have that state church, so you don't have that competitive marketplace in Britain, in the United Kingdom. Other places, you have, I think, vestiges of some sort of establishment, but they tend to be ignored by a lot of people. And again, I think one of the reasons the First Amendment is America's best idea is that it works both sides. That is to say, it has shielded the government from religious factionalism, being damaged by religious factionalism, and it is also, as Roger Williams was arguing, it has, I think, protected the faith from being too closely associated with the state. And that has given us a very salubrious religious marketplace, it seems to me.
Hey.
Hi.
Can you please speak to indigenous religions and how they participate in this conversation, if at all?
Yeah, indigenous religions. First of all, it's pretty hard to generalize because there's so many of them, and they're so dispersed and diffuse. But I guess the main point of reference would be the Taos Blue Lake incident in 1906, when the U.S. government appropriated Taos Blue Lake, which is a sacred space for the Taos Pueblos in New Mexico, into the Kit Carson National Forest. And this was utter desecration for the Taos Pueblos. And they fought it for decades. And finally, it wasn't until the early 1970s, in part because of Fred Harris, who was a Democratic senator from Oklahoma and part Native American, prevailed on Congress to return that sacred space to Taos Pueblos. But part of the argument that they used, that is the Taos Pueblos used, in arguing for the return of that property was the First Amendment, allowing them the free exercise of their religion. That's probably the best example I can think of.
So I appreciate the fact that the Upper Valley has the chance to listen to you and hear you. But I wonder if you would talk a little bit about how you are promoting the book nationally, and I'd love to hear some anecdotes about where you've been, who's listened to you.
Yeah.
Maybe I should be asking your publisher.
Well, the book was just released on Tuesday, so it's
Right.
Yeah, it's new, and so I've done a couple of podcasts. I think one is out there with Salon, something called help me. Standing Room Only. That's out there, and I can't say this with any confidence because it's been postponed more times than I can count. But I'm scheduled to be on Morning Joe tomorrow at 7:30. So I went to New York last week to be on Morning Joe, and I did the podcast in New York, but then Morning Joe said, no, we have to defer it to next week. So I have no confidence it's going to happen, but it's scheduled anyway, so We'll see. And I think there are other podcasts that are kind of lining up to interview. Apparently podcasts are the way to promote books these days. That's I keep hearing this. I don't quite understand it, but that's...
Yeah, I want to thank you also for being here. I'm wondering if, because not all faith leaders are on board with Christian nationalism.
Yeah, sure.
Right?
Right.
So how, is there a way to pull those faith leaders together to, talk about this issue in their...
Right.
From the pulpit, where they have an audience of people who want to preserve their faiths,
Right. Yeah.
but indicate that this adoption of and crossing the line that we seem to push
Yep.
every day
Yeah.
is happening.
Yeah, there are some organizations that do that. The Baptist Joint Committee is a very good organization that's trying to guard that wall of separation, and that probably needs larger context. Did I mention that Roger Williams is the founder of the Baptist tradition in America? Maybe I didn't mention that. Yeah. Roger Williams, the wall of separation guy, is the founder of the Baptist tradition in America. So this notion of the separation of church and state, along with liberty of conscience, is part of the DNA of the Baptist tradition in America. And for decades, even centuries, we could rely on Baptists to kind of patrol this wall of separation. Sadly, in 1979, there was a conservative takeover of the Southern Baptist Convention, which is the largest Protestant denomination in the United States, and they utterly switched on that. And so they no longer are watchmen on the wall of separation between church and state. So the Baptist Joint Committee is kind of a remnant group that is trying to maintain that witness. The other group that's very important is Americans United for the Separation of Church and State, and they're very active in kind of patrolling this wall of separation between church and state. But we're losing, to be honest, and a lot of that is due to the Supreme Court. And it makes me very sad. I don't know what to do about that. I try to be hopeful, but the Supreme Court doesn't offer much hope right now, it seems to me.
Are the libertarians in the New Hampshire legislature largely Christian nationalists?
I have no idea. The question was, are the libertarians in the New Hampshire legislature largely Christian nationalists? I don't know that. I don't track that very closely. Well, I should ask Deb. No?
I think they're just isolationists.
Oh, okay.
But I don't know about their faith. I kind of don't think so, but I'll find out.
Oh, okay, there you go. This is my go-to expert for New Hampshire politics. Deb is also my neighbor, so, and we've known each other for 80 years or so.
Oh, that's a little. I'm not that old. But over 40.
Yeah. Yes.
What protections are non-Christians likely to lose when we become a Christian nation? Do you anticipate?
Well, I think if these folks succeed in rewriting criminal and civil law, I think there's everything to lose at that point. freedom of thought, freedom of expression, I think, are all imperiled by these folks. Some of you may have seen an excerpt of this interview on CNN with this guy named Doug Wilson out in Moscow, Idaho. I've never met him, but I'm thinking about writing about him, in which he believes, for example, that women should not be allowed to vote. He wants to repeal the 19th Amendment. That households should have only one vote, the male head of the household vote for the entire household. That, we'll start there. There's something to lose there. Yeah.
But would they be picking on like Muslims or Jewish?
Well, they do already. I think they do already. Not so much Jews, because evangelicals have this odd relationship with Jews. I like to say that evangelicals are simultaneously pro-Israel and anti-Semitic. Pro-Israel in the sense that Israel, right or wrong, in terms of the state of Israel. Anti-Semitic from a Jewish perspective, because they seek ultimately the conversion of Jews to Christianity. So,
Hi, could you give a little history of the lobbying efforts in Washington on behalf of Christian groups? I'm aware that there's pretty powerful and well-funded
the question is, could I give a little history on the influence of Christian groups, lobbying Christian groups in Washington? I'm not sure I know them all, but I mean, let me just speak more generally. And that is to say that, and a lot of people don't understand this history, within evangelicalism for really the middle decades of the 20th century, roughly from the Scopes trial in 1925, we just passed the 100th anniversary, to Jimmy Carter's campaign for the presidency in 1975-76, roughly that half century, evangelicals were not politically active. They were certainly not organized or mobilized politically. Many of them not even registered to vote. And what happens in the 1970s is that they become politicized. And the standard interpretation is that they became politicized in opposition to the Roe v. Wade decision of January 22nd, 1973. And I've spent far too many years researching that, but I can say without fear of contradiction, abortion had nothing to do with their political activism in the 1970s. They mobilized politically to defend racial segregation at places like Bob Jones University and so-called segregation academies, including Jerry Falwell's Segregation Academy in Lynchburg, Virginia. That's what got them motivated and organized in politics. It had nothing to do with abortion. Abortion was tacked on later, almost by accident, just before the 1980 presidential election. But since that time, they've been very active politically, as you know, various organizations, but also you have schools, institutions like Patrick Henry College, which is out near Dulles Airport, outside of Washington, D.C., that was actually founded for evangelical children who had been homeschooled. And their big push is to get their students involved in Washington. So they have, for a very small school, they have hundreds of their students as interns on Capitol Hill, working for various judges and so forth. When I interviewed the president of the school, the founder of the school, Michael Ferris, some years ago now, he told me the thing he heard most frequently from parents is, I want my kid to be on the Supreme Court someday. And this is what they're trying to do. They're trying to mobilize this whole generation to become politically active. So yes, there are organizations who support these efforts in terms of lobbying and also financially, but I think the larger threat probably is from places like Patrick Henry College.
So this is, even though I edited your book, this is not a plant. This is a question that just occurred to me tonight, and I'd love to hear your response to it. And
why didn't you ask the question when I was writing the book?
I don't know.
You're the editor, right?
And a lead-in will be the comment about what do people, possibly have to lose. The cert petition from the woman who didn't want to sign a gay marriage license.
Yeah.
And she's asking the Supreme Court to not only look at her case, but to overturn federal protection for gay marriage, because it impinges on her freedom of religion.
Right.
and we'll see whether the Supreme Court takes it up.
Right.
But what I was going to ask, which I think ties to that, is in the First Amendment, freedom of speech and freedom of assembly were also included in the same amendment with the disestablishment. So as a religionist or a historian of what the original intent, what do you think was in the minds of the framers and the founders when they put that freedom of speech and freedom of assembly together with freedom of religion?
I don't know that I know the answer to that question, but in some ways it's kind of a logical following to the first part of the First Amendment. Has to do with religion. It's protecting individual rights, and they were very clear about that. Madison, by the way, did not want to draft a Bill of Rights. He thought that that was not a good place to go initially. And his fear was that if there was not a right that was explicitly protected in the Bill of Rights, then it would be not considered a right. And so he wanted to kind of leave it much more nebulous. But then they prevailed upon him to draft the Bill of Rights, including, of course, the First Amendment. And so I imagine that he saw the free expression of religion together with disestablishment as kind of hand in hand with freedom of speech, and that's probably why he put it in the First Amendment. But we need a Madison scholar to weigh in on that, and I'm not a Madison scholar. I don't claim to be. Yeah.
Your recent comments make me want to ask this question: Do we have in our government a good definition of when it's a religion and not a passionate movement, and then treat it accordingly?
A religion as opposed to what?
A passionate movement of some sort. When does religion apply and not apply in the Constitution?
I'm not sure I get the gist of your question. So
what defines a religion? Maybe it's a simple.
Oh well, that's been debated for years. Are you making a distinction between, or asking about a distinction between kind of institutionalized religion and more individual expressions?
I'm not sure.
You're not sure? Yeah, again, I think the constitutional protection is pretty broad, is to say, it's all protected, right? Liberty of conscience, freedom of speech, freedom of expression, it's all protected by the Constitution, and I think that's what the founders intended. Yeah.
So the passionate movement that's not religious, if you call it that, would be protected.
Sure. I mean, environmentalism, right? Sure. Yeah. That would be a good example of that, it seems to me. We haven't talked about the Johnson Amendment. You want to talk about that quickly? The Johnson Amendment, which is under attack now, as you probably know. The background for the Johnson Amendment was Lyndon Johnson was running for re-election to the Senate in 1954. And there were a group of very wealthy Texans, including the Hunts, if I remember correctly, who were putting up a lot of money through tax-exempt organizations to try to defeat Lyndon Johnson. They regarded Johnson as a flaming liberal, which we can debate about that. But and they were trying to defeat him. And so he introduced before Congress, and Congress approved the Johnson Amendment that forbade the use of political endorsements from tax-exempt organizations, okay? Logical thing to do, right? Now, this is under attack. Trump has promised many times to repeal the Johnson Amendment. The IRS recently issued some findings, or I don't know a statement saying that churches, religious organizations can now make religious or political endorsements. I question the legality of that. It seems to me an act of Congress would have to be reversed by Congress, but these days with the judiciary, everything's up for grabs. So I don't know where that stands. But the argument on the part of religious right people in particular is that the Johnson Amendment impinges on their free speech. This is getting back to Chip, linking these two. Because these groups can't make these political endorsements from the pulpit, for example. Well, let's think about this. First of all, we have to understand and acknowledge that tax exemption is a form of public subsidy. I needn't debate that, but let me just give an example. I'm looking out here at the Congregational Church, right? The Congregational Church doesn't pay property taxes to the town of Norwich. I'm willing to bet. They may volunteer some money. That's not my business one way or the other. But it means that all the other good citizens of Norwich have to pony up a little bit more to pay for police protection, fire services, parks, whatever it might be. And that extends all the way up to the federal government, defense spending, everything else, right? Tax exemption is a form of public subsidy. And all the Johnson Amendment asked was for these organizations in turn to refrain from making political endorsements. A pretty good deal, right? And for decades, most religious groups have considered this to be a pretty good deal. We will forswear political endorsements in exchange for keeping our tax-exempt status. This is now under attack by the IRS, by the Trump administration. But let's think about what would happen if this Johnson Amendment were repealed. Wouldn't it make churches or religious organizations into money laundering schemes? Suppose I had $1 billion at my discretion. Don't worry. I could go to, say, Joel Osteen down in Houston, Texas, who's got a congregation of 45,000 people or whatever it might be, and say, Joel, I'm willing to give your church $1 billion. Now, it's a rich operation, and he's got a lot of money, but I expect a number with a B behind it probably would get his attention. All I'm going to ask in return is that once in a while in your little sermons or whatever he calls them, you make a favorable reference to, I don't know, J.D. Vance or whoever it might be, and we'll both be satisfied. Moreover, I'm going to get a tax exemption for my $1 billion donation to your church. Do we want that? I mean, this turns religious groups into money laundering operations. And what we need from religious groups right now, more than perhaps any time in our history, is for people of faith to offer a prophetic witness, to offer a prophetic voice in our time. We desperately need that. And if my voice as a minister, or in my case, an Episcopal priest, is up for the highest bidder, I'm not going to be a prophet. I'm not going to offer a prophetic voice to the people who might listen to me. And that, I think, is the real peril of the Johnson Amendment. But it's under attack, I think, quite determinedly by the Trump administration right now.
But isn't it, this is, I know, for Janus TV, isn't it the case that that distinction has been somewhat fuzzy for quite a while? Because, I mean, I'm not a Catholic, but I've heard about Catholic cars being flyered by people who want congregations to vote a certain way during, when they come out of church, and there's been sort of indications on the part of clergy in the Catholic Church that this is a way you should vote and this is a way you shouldn't. And there are probably other churches doing exactly that same thing.
Yeah, and certainly that happens in the black churches. So, but to give up on that principle, I think, is a very dangerous precedent. And what I would rather see is the Internal Revenue Service be more assiduous in enforcing the Johnson Amendment rather than giving up on it altogether.
You just used the term prophetic voice.
Yes.
Would you clarify what you mean by that?
Prophetic voice.
And who has it?
Well, not many folks these days. Prophetic voice, I think, is Martin Luther King Jr. would be a good example of that sort of thing. Abraham Joshua Heschel, prophetic voice. I think in previous years, people like Randall offered a prophetic voice. Dorothy Day, Thomas Merton. These are religious folks. But I think what I mean by prophetic voice is somebody who is willing to take his or her religious principles and scruples and apply them to our current situation. And frankly, in the tradition of the Hebrew prophets, to call for confession, call for an amendment of ways. So that's what I mean by prophetic voice. As I said, I'm an Episcopal priest. I do a lot of supply work, particularly around Vermont, but other places as well. And it's no secret that the Episcopal Church in particular is facing dwindling congregations. The church is literally dying out. But it seems to me that's a good place that a prophetic voice might be offered, and maybe as a source of rejuvenation for some of these parishes, some of these congregations. But that's going to take a lot of courage on somebody's part to do it.
You said the Christian Nationalists have the numbers. I know they are loud.
Yeah, they're loud.
And they've cowed people.
Yes.
People are afraid of them.
Yeah.
But in a fair fight, do they really have a majority of the voters in this country?
I don't think it's a majority. We're talking now about white evangelicals, so black evangelicals typically don't fall into that category. The numbers are roughly about 25% of the population. So it's a huge minority, but it is still a minority. But they're organized, and they're dedicated, and they're trying to change things. So that's what makes them very powerful. And I don't need to tell you that the Democratic Party, is in tatters these days, and those people at the left simply haven't been able to muster the organization or the will or the message to counteract what's going on from the right these days.
I have a passion for the United Nations and the Sustainable Development Goals and the post-World War II movement globally to bring some of this separation of church and state yet work around the world. Do you see some of the solution of our issues coming from the places where we've been participating globally? I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know how to answer that question. You're probably better qualified to answer that than I don't. I can't think at the moment of a place that would provide a model for what we're trying to do or what we're trying to prevent. In part because our system is so different in terms of this configuration of church and state that I just can't think of an analog to that. Maybe if I had a little bit more time, I could think of one, but right now I don't. I guess one historical example probably would be the Netherlands in the 17th century, which was probably the most diverse and progressive society in the Western world. And it was precisely because they were tolerant of various groups, various religious groups. So that would be the only model I can kind of think of. And there's some evidence that some of the documents coming out of the Netherlands actually did influence the founders when they were writing our charter documents. But that's the only one that comes immediately to mind. Sure. Hi.
Hi. I'm thinking about a child who grows up in your Episcopal church and learns how to live an honorable life. And as the church attendance continues to diminish, what's going to substitute for that?
It's a great question. I don't know. We're talking about education in morals and morality. Traditionally, that has come from religion. And by the way, that's one of the things that the founders recognized. I mean, they were deists, almost all of them. But if you look at their rhetoric, and this is what part of the rhetoric that has been twisted by people like David Barton, they talk about the importance of religion and Christianity in particular for moral development and even for the sustenance of this new nation, to have this sense of morality. So historically, religion has come from morality. I think the challenge we face in a multicultural society is how do we instill a sense of morality overall without drawing from any one religious tradition. That is, how do we develop a vocabulary of morals that does no violence to any one particular religious tradition or people who have no religious tradition. I think that's the big challenge facing us in the 21st century, and I don't have an answer for it, really. The humanists have their answer. I think Unitarians have their answer. Various religious groups have their particular answer, but I don't see anything that's kind of global that gets us to that point. But you put your finger on, I think, a real crisis that we face right now in society. How do we develop this moral vocabulary that is universal enough to be inclusive of everyone and does not draw from any one particular tradition? I think it's very difficult. I face this as a parent. How do you have that language? How do you have that conversation? In many ways, for years, religion has been kind of a crutch. And I don't mean that pejoratively or dismissively, but that's been the default language for talking about morality. Now, with many people in this country and a growing number of people who claim no religious affiliation whatsoever, what do you draw on for that conversation? I think that's a real problem. That's why we need a prophetic voice, right? You're in charge.
I think that will end our Q&A for tonight. Thank you so much for asking. I'm sure Randall is very appreciative of all your
Yes,
answers
thank you for
and
coming.
great
Appreciate it.
conversations.